Welcome to another session with After Heart Ministries. I'm Rabbi Q, and we are continuing our series on signal. A couple things that I want to say is that we're going to need to do a little bit of recap on signal, but I really want to kind of lay some groundwork and say that what you think you understand about language, what you think you understand about words and grammar, and what you think you understand about letters is about to change today. So, to begin with, let's talk about signal versus noise. When you are tuning a radio, and for those of you who have never tuned a radio, you should definitely take time to try to get a radio and listen to some actual broadcasted stuff, because it's a dying art. It's a dying art where a person sits in front of a DJ set, a couple turntables. They might be digital or it might be on the computer, but the point being is that they sit there and they entertain you with their commentary and their jokes and all that kind of stuff. And then the commercials play because why? Because we still have small businesses in a local community, and you get to experience a person actually, instead of a computer or an AI telling you all the benefits of subscribing to their streaming system. It's free. All you got to do is turn a knob on your radio, and most vehicles still have that. The newer vehicles, from what I understand, don't. However, the point is that when you hear that sound like a rushing stream, that's noise. And when you hear actual sound, music, voice, etc., that's signal. So we really need to kind of get into this a little bit. And one of the reasons we do is because there are some things, including, say, in Genesis, that talk about how there is a deity speaking. Now, we use the word God in English because we have a very bastardized, Germanic influenced Latin language, okay? Generally speaking, we have a Romantic language. It's made up of Latin, and so that's why I say Romantic, because it's kind of derived from the Roman Empire, influenced upon the British, who would be speaking Gaelic or some form of a Celtic type of language. And then, of course, there is the Old English and the Germanic, et cetera, and if you listen to a Dutch person speak, you'll hear a lot of English words. Okay, so the reason this is relevant is because when we use the English language to operate within a Hebrew context, we can have some noise and not signal. Now, does that mean you need to go out and learn Hebrew? Do you need to go get Hebrew for Dummies and listen to the CD and try to repeat what they say? No. And the reason for this is because, number one, when we look back at the ancient Hebrew language, we have three very important points that we need to look at. Number one is what we would call historical, or what we would call anthropological nuance between regions, right? Second is we have a mysticism to this language. And when I say a mysticism, you need to understand that that is when you have some sort of internal connection to God. That's what mysticism generally means, that you are somehow connected to the divine, okay? Now, in the form of Hebrew thought and in an understanding of the four worlds and the four levels of Hebrew interpretation and the 10 emanations of God, which are found not only in the New Testament but the Old Testament. Or for those of you who would like to respect the Torah, Nevi'im and Ketuvim, or the law, the prophets, and the writings, and the commentary upon Torah, which would be the New Testament. Now, what's important to realize then is that there is a mysticism element to ancient Hebrew. In other words, they knew things that have to do with, say, a word that we would uncommonly use as quote unquote Christians: magic, okay, energy, okay, and also how that somehow is connected into the divine. Okay, and then the last third point of Hebrew in terms of nuance is that there seems to be what we would call a dark set of Hebrew letters and their interpretations, and a light set of Hebrew letters and their interpretations. In a moment, I will help you understand how this dark set and light set seem to coexist and what their purpose is. But what I can tell you is that there are certain letters in the Hebrew alphabet that mean two different things. And before you get caught up in what your pastor says in the pulpit, the Hebrew language is so difficult to understand because one verb can mean 30 different things, and therefore it's just better if we read the English. Well, that poor pastor, in his naivety, not his ignorance, because I feel like ignorance is a little bit of a choice. And I feel like, say, the Council of Nicaea operated in ignorance, not naivety. But generally speaking, we can acknowledge and identify that ignorance is a choice to continue to not know. Let's just put it that way, okay? But in that same premise, we will say that that pastor is naive because his teachers, who were also naive, were influenced by ignorant people, okay? So those ignorant people chose to create a system that does not work when it comes to ancient Hebrew philosophy, lifestyle, etc. You say, well, why should that matter? I'm a Christian. I'm an American, right? Okay, so I'm going to touch on a few points here. The one is definitely the American argument, right? Two is complexity, and three is philosophy and theory. Okay, so the first thing that I want to say is that when the pastor said that at the pulpit, he did not know that the founder of Protestant Christianity, which gives us the freedom or liberty to be non-denominational in the first place, said it is an absolutely ignorant person who, if they choose to study the Bible, continues without learning the ancient languages. You know who said that? Luther. Now, I may have paraphrased it, but that's fine. I know that within the context or within the spirit of what he was trying to say is, don't be stupid here. If you're going to try to interpret the Bible, you need to learn the ancient languages. Now, let me tell you, that was one Jew-hating, ignorant human being, okay? So when we identify that Luther chose to be ignorant and yet says that the only way you could interpret the Bible correctly is to learn the languages, and guess what? You go to a seminary, what I call cemetery school, because it's just the dead burying the dead. But you go there, and within the first year or two, you take a Hebrew class and you learn to parse. Then maybe in year 3 or 4 of undergraduate, you learn Greek and you learn to parse. And for those who get into the master's and doctorate level, you learn Ugaritic and Coptic, possibly, and even possibly Syriac. I believe that's how you pronounce it. What's my point? My point is you don't learn English, you don't speak English, you don't deal with English, because why? You already know it because you're an American. So let's get to point number one in that. Point number one is you say, I'm an American, I speak English, I'm a Gentile Christian, I'm not a Jew, I don't need to learn Hebrew, blah, 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 right? Okay. Now, I'm not going to stay on this soapbox for long, but I need to get into something here. The spirit, heart, and soul of a true American is dead. Absolutely dead. And if you want proof, all you need to do is take a look at how things are done in this country right now. Okay? Because one of the biggest theories of the Roman Empire was do not interfere, right? Allow them to do whatever they're going to do as long as they pay tribute and as long as they request our assistance as the military and as long as they're willing to contribute water and land to the empire, then leave them alone. Let them practice their own religion. In fact, the procurators or the protectorates who were to stand over the communities were to become ambassadors. In other words, they were to learn the culture and the religion and how to allow it to occur within the Roman process. Now, we know it was abused, and I'm not defending the Roman Empire. But the reason I bring this up is because when we went into a state of believing that it was absolutely necessary to throw off authority that is tyrannical and has demonstrated over a long period of time abuses of power, we established a country of free people, meaning they could choose to do whatever they want, and the consequences would be based upon natural consequences of that currency. Now, what I mean by that, not currency, of that culture. What I mean by that is that if you shot somebody, it was pretty good chance that you probably were going to have to answer to why you shot them. However, there wasn't something saying that you couldn't shoot them, right? Now, I know I know that's an extreme case, but where I really want to get into this is the idea that basically we as a people decided to be free from tyranny, free from governance, free from somebody else monitoring and deciding what's going to be good for your lives. Well, guess what? Let me tell you where the infiltration actually occurred to what we have today. The church. The church. And what I mean by that is that the church itself determined that you, as a common citizen, cannot know how to interpret the Bible. And that you, as a common citizen, cannot know how to connect to God. Oh, where did we learn that? We learned that because who? The Pope was the vicar of Christ. And when Luther came along, he was offering just Augustinian philosophy over the top of a what? Papacy. Which eventually, just so you know, stayed Episcopalian. What's Episcopalian? Where one leader governs an entire group, okay? It stayed Episcopalian. It did not turn into Congregational. It did not turn into Presbyterian. Calvin comes along and offers Presbytery. He says, no, we need elders. We need a board of directors to decide the circumstances of the church. And so that's where we have the Presbyterians, which consequently, no matter what Presbyterian church is in the United States, it's governed by a synod and very specifically a confession, which they determined a long time ago and pretty much stick with. Why is this so important? Because you, as the common consumer of religion, are told how to have religion. And that is not the American spirit. That is not what we decided was going to happen in this country. In fact, the very existence of a monitoring, a determination that the people themselves cannot handle governing themselves is actually very, very dangerous to the culture at which you claim to be allegiant to, which is Christianity. The Christian culture itself is not based around a system where the church was to monitor, okay? And that's going to become important here because I think one of the biggest derelictions of the church itself is church discipline. The context that a common person Christian through an English Bible with an uneducated sense of duty believes that they have the capability to do what many have spent years studying how to do, and that is judge. And I'm going to tell you that when it comes to signal and when it comes to noise, judging is huge, okay? Now, the reason why this is so important is because when we are working with a system that is backed by a social, democratic, westernized thinking, you have already a deck stacked against you. You need to understand that our westernized American social democratic system influences our seminary system. And you need to realize, and I can tell you, there are certain places you can go, say on YouTube or wherever, and you could see the deeper things of this conspiracy that I'm not claiming. And what I mean by that is I don't align with them, but they have proof of what I'm saying in the extreme. I'm not saying it in the extreme, and I don't agree with everything they say. But what you need to understand is they have proof. Okay? Now, where this becomes absolutely imperative to this process is that there was supposed to be within the American spirit a sovereignty of the people. And interestingly enough, where that came from specifically was that original Declaration of Independence. And so when we are working with that process, we need to realize and acknowledge that it was not the sentiment of the founding fathers that religion be governed by a leader who is governed by a government system. Now you say, oh, wait a minute, there's separation in church and state. Oh, really? Let me point this out to you. If you were truly able to exercise your right to freedom to practice religion independently, then why are there blue laws? Why are there laws saying that a liquor store cannot be open on a Sunday? Now, the reason I bring this up is not because I'm trying to be political or conspiratorial, but I'm helping you understand how badly you do not know how to interpret the Bible that you use to try to convince people when you're actually trying to convince yourself of what you believe in an English version that even the founding father of Protestant Christianity, which is supposedly the liberty from the Catholic Church, except that the Catholic Church had a very influential individual named Augustine, who consequently Luther was an Augustinian monk. So what it really is Neo-Catholicism. Now, the reason this is so important is not because I want to alienate the Catholics, because I know some really cool Catholics, and I can tell you, oh, in a lot of ways, they are better than most Protestant Christians I know. Now, where this becomes important is in the fact that we actually have within the confines of our religion an alienation of the very things that give it power. Okay? I'm going to get back to that. All right. So I said I wanted to harp on the American spirit for a minute, and I wanted to harp on that whole kind of that what liberty really is versus what we actually have in front of us. But what I really need you to understand is that if you are going to operate within a religion that was formed not only around Jewish values, as it were, and a Torah-based foundation, but you need to also understand that the philosophies, this is important, and the theories formulated by the quote-unquote Christian fathers, whether they be ante-Nicene, which means they were before Nicaea, or they be after Nicaea, it is important for you to know that they don't necessarily constitute an authority by which we could identify the truth. Case in point, Protestant Christianity generally rejects the papacy, but the papacy itself claims that Peter and Paul went to New York. Oh, wait, it wasn't New York, it was Rome. And when they got to Rome, they basically taught that Easter, the feast of Ishtar, is actually the feast by which we would identify with the resurrection of Yeshua. Now, furthermore, it is important to understand that within the confines of that, it was taught by this particular individual who consequently was on the Council of Nicaea and who consequently was anti-Semitic and who consequently was challenged by a separate bishop who consequently was eventually burned at the stake for disavowing the Caesar as God. Why is this so important? Because the guy who claims that Paul and Peter went to Rome and established the papacy and established the religious ceremonies or holidays that we now celebrate is the same guy who said that we should get rid of Passover, the same guy who claims that that leadership is in Rome, who consequently somehow endorses a Caesar who the other guy refused to acknowledge and was burned at the stake. Now, I'm just going to say, for the record, I'm not trying to be accusatory here. I'm stating the facts as they are seen. The Jews are called patricides by who? By Constantine. Literally, father killers, right? They are called a odious fellowship. You look up the word odious. Now, where this becomes important is in the fact that those theories and those acknowledgments supposedly create the foundation for the religion that you now practice in English, in America, as a social democratic westernized culture. When truth is that your faith, your religion, the foundation of your religion, and everything that is contained within the philosophies and theories of that are actually Eastern, non-democratic, non-social, and definitely not Western. They are Eastern, mystical. If they are Orthodox, they're not fundamental, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then on top of all of that, they are Hebrew and Torah-based. Now, there's a huge controversy about Torah observance versus Christians, and I can tell you, I've had my fair share of going rounds with people, and I can tell you there's been pastors who have been receptive to the things that I've suggested, and there's pastors who have rejected what I have suggested. In fact, I can tell you one of the most appalling and absolutely asinine comments that I've ever heard from a singular lay minister, not even a pastor, who claims to have an authority on the scripture, leads his own Bible studies, mentors people. I see him often at the coffee shops talking with an individual. We do not need to know the historical background of Jesus Christ and his culture. We need to know what was established later on. Consequently, he is a reformist, a supersessionalist, and he consequently believes that the sign gifts, quote unquote, were done away with, along with the Torah and everything else that really necessarily governs the religion of God versus man governing the religion of God in his Western social democratic culture. Now, where this becomes important is in the fact that when I hear somebody say, well, I just keep it simple. It's Christ and him crucified, right? That's what I hear all the time. And yet, the reason why you get to spout that garbage is because your pastor told you to keep it simple. Because your pastor, in his naivety, was told by his school or the influence of the church already upon him to keep it simple. Well, guess what? When we look back at the ante-Nicene fathers, Tertullian, Origen, Marcion, Praxis, a number of the others, and of course Tertullian had challenged a lot of those people. I think I can't remember if John Chrysostom is actually before Nicaea or not, but anyways, all of them get complexed in their theoretical challenges of these particular individuals. Most of it is based upon a heretical theory called Trinitarianism, and a lot of it is also based upon an anti-Semitic sentiment that the Jews were divorced from God, which is a very inaccurate and inappropriate identification with not only the nation of Israel, but the nation of Judah, and a lack of understanding about the northern and southern kingdoms, a lack of understanding about the diaspora, a lack of understanding about the lost tribes, of which Yeshua says he came to save the lost sheep, etc., etc. Now, where this becomes very, very important, your God and his connection with you is not simple. Okay? Let me make that clear. Your life is not simple. There are little nuances and complexities that cause a level of stress that you don't even realize you have because you're in a state of disassociation a majority of the time. You ever gotten in your car, driven to work, got to work, and forgot how you got there or didn't even realize you got there? Walk in and the first thing that happens is the person's like, oh, here's this, you need to do this, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, because you never tuned in. You never were there. Why is that? Because we are so overwhelmed by the complexities of life that we have no business saying, oh, I'll keep it simple. Keep it simple, stupid. You know what? Let me tell you something. I have identified that that is a virtual impossibility within the context of a normal human life. And almost every person who has said, keep it simple, stupid, I have later discovered was an alcoholic, addicted to porn, doing some sort of bad thing. And when I say bad thing, let me make that clear. I'm not talking about necessarily breaking the law, but doing unethical things within their business, etc., because they have no foundation. There is no authority by which you do not murder. Thou shalt not murder. Oh, that's let's see, where is that? Oh, that's Old Testament. Ah, the Old Testament was done away with. That's right. It's just a suggestion if you really need it. Oh, but when we want to be political about someone's lifestyle, we definitely need it, but only then. Because then, oh, wait a minute, 2 verses later, you definitely don't want to get a tattoo, right? Oh, wait, you can get tattoos. In fact, you can actually get the name of God tattooed on your arm. So, in principle, and when we talk about, for example, in Isaiah 66, where it says he'll come back with a strong rebuke for those who what? Consume swine's flesh. Okay. So, and here's the thing I love is that verse also says something about rats. And so when they're saying something about rats, because people don't eat rats today, they say, oh, well, that's probably just something historical back then. It doesn't apply anymore because we can cook pork the way that it's supposed to be cooked and we can kill the parasites in it. And I'm like, okay, y'all understand. Beef doesn't have parasites in it unless it touches a counter that had parasites in it. Now, there's all kinds of people that say, oh, no, 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 there's special parasites within beef. I'm going to tell you, those are the only ones, those are the ones that came from the slaughterhouse and the feedlots where they weren't allowed to graze on the stuff that they're supposed to graze on that causes them to be able to get rid of those parasites. What's my point? My point is that pork is just guaranteed to have parasites, and that's all it says right there in the FDA. Why would you eat it? Why would you even try to cook it enough that it kills the bugs? I don't even want to talk about it. Okay, so the point being is that basically what we're come down to is this principle that, oh, I'm going to keep it simple. It's Christ and him crucified. Okay, first of all, what is Christ? Do you even know what that means? Do you even know why it's relevant to your life? Because if you think it has to do with the fact that he went to the cross and died for you, you're a hot mess, and I'm going to tell you why. Because before he ever came along, there was an explanation, not only within the ancient pictographs of what a Mashiach is, that's the word Messiah, which means the anointed one, which Kriya in Greek is oil, and therefore Christ is somebody who is covered in oil, which consequently was the anointing process for kings, priests, and prophets only. And in that context of anointing, there was a concept of what that would entail. But short version is you have no idea what the word Christ actually means. And then we have him crucified. What does that mean for you? You think that means that he just took away your sins and you could do whatever you want? Because I've had people flat out tell me, well, Christ died for my sins, therefore I can eat pork. Okay, so what that says is that you can violate Torah. You can actually not eat pork, or you can eat pork and sin, and then Christ took care of it. That's exactly what you just told me. Okay, there's other arguments besides that, but I'm going to get rid of that. Because we need to move to the third point, because guess what? We haven't even started yet. And I know that you're like, well, wait a minute, why do we talk about all this? Because you need this as the foundation. You need to know the limitations of language and culture and choices that you think you're making on your own that are actually influenced by years and years of tyranny. Okay? It's time to liberate. It's time to unhook. It's time to do what even your founding father, who was a Jew-hating jerk, actually did, which was learn the ancient languages and understand why. Last point on this soapbox, and that is, and you think because I said I'm not going to stay on it long, this is long, you don't know me. Okay, so the premise is that the last point is theory and philosophy. There are people who I have talked to who say, oh, no, we can't touch upon theory. It's already been decided. By whom and by what authority? The same authority that said that Peter and Paul went to Rome and that Peter established the papacy, which the anti-Semitic, let's see, what was it? Tear down their pulpits and burn their synagogues, or maybe it was the other way around, tear down their synagogues and burn their pulpits. I can't remember which one it was. That idiot said that the papacy didn't have any authority. So we'll agree with him on that, even though he was a bit of an idiot. And then we'll say, oh, wait a minute, but he still says that Peter and Paul went to Rome because he follows the rest of the doctrine. The rest of the doctrine that was supposedly established where I can flat out prove that the point behind Yeshua coming as a Jewish Messiah in a Jewish culture at the time that he came is extremely important, and you don't even know why. You don't even know the reasons. You think you know the reasons because that's what you were told. But we need to unhook. We need to liberate. We need to operate within the American spirit, or we need to just kind of stop doing what we're doing. Because truth be told is that there was a reason why we decided to have the rights and rules and opportunities that we have. And I can tell you one of them is to access and practice your religion according to the way that you want to, not according to the way your pastor wants you to or your church wants you to, because I'm about to deal with church discipline and it's going to blow your mind. Okay, so now here is the crux of this whole thing. The English language is not sufficient to give you the information you need to connect to God. Oh boy, did Rabbi Q just say, I'm going to tell you right now, the only reason why my inbox is not going to be full is because the algorithm doesn't dump me into everybody's For You page. But I can tell you what I just said is so controversial that it would get all kinds of things, because you're supposed to be able to read the Bible in your language, because that's who established that? Wycliffe, Luther, humans, that's right. What language was it actually written in, and what culture and what people did God choose to preserve it in and offer it to humanity in the first place? Jews, Hebrews, Israel, not the nations. Not uncircumcised Philistines who now have a Messiah who they have pretty much just stolen from the Jews. Oh yeah, you don't like that one either. Okay, so the reason why this is so important is because if you don't grasp the level of seriousness of the nuances that have altered the state of everything, then you will never, ever realize the seriousness of why you were called in the first place. You know, it's interesting. I will get somebody who has left this congregation or who has challenged this congregation or has in some way, sometime in my lifetime, has converged with me and has left away from me and has come back. And I will hear words every single time that it's almost predictable when I have spent time trying to explain to him what I'm trying to explain to you right now. I don't know what I believe anymore. Did I create that doubt? Did I create that disconnection with what you believed? No, life did. And all I did was say, I'm going to bet you that what you think you understand about the Bible, you don't. And I'm going to bet you that that can actually hurt you. Oh, then we got the people who say, oh, but it's a salvation issue and this is not a salvation issue, so I shouldn't have to worry about it. It's not a salvation issue that I can't eat pork. You don't even know what salvation is. Okay? So just right off the bat, I'm just going to put that out there. You don't know what salvation is. You do not understand the Torah. You don't understand the law. And in addition to that, you have come up with what's right in your own eyes because that's what you were told to do, which consequently is the spirit of Israel in the book of Judges. Go look. The people began to do what was right in their own eyes, and God sold them to Midian. Whoa. Okay, that's dangerous. So, if there's a right and wrong in terms of Torah, then we should probably figure that out. Okay. So now what we need to do is we need to jump onto the board and discuss some things that are important. But before we do, I'm going to explain to you that the invisible attributes of God. What is an attribute? An attribute is a qualifier assigned to a person, place, or thing that identifies it. Okay? So if we were to ask, what is the identity of Yahweh? Like where would we begin? What is the identity of Yahweh? Oh, well, he's God. Yeah, fail. Let me tell you why fail. Because you still are using English words. And I'm just going to put out there that you can't go from an ancient nomadic language to an urban language to a derelict, uncircumcised language to a philosophical language that is not concrete, to a language designed around the simplicity of nouns and grammar, to a language of barbarians, to a language that is a conglomeration of three different of those languages, and hope that you actually are still going to preserve sounding, which is transliteration, which is why we have Jesus instead of Yeshua. Translation, which the word Jesus means nothing, but Yeshua in its ancient pictographic language has an actual literal meaning in its story form. And finally, if you don't preserve grammar, you don't know actually what is being said. Because in the Hebrew versus the English, we have something called a piel or a intensive. The difference between breaking something versus smashing something. The difference between killing something versus murdering something is in the nuance on how it's pronounced and the grammar behind the insertion of vowels as an infix. Oh, but it gets even better. All of that is actually still a pictographic story. And so, in that context, it is very important for you to understand that there are mystical nuances of the pictographic story that are lost in the English language. Meaning what? Meaning part of what the oracles of God are that Paul said a Jew has an advantage over a Gentile in are not in the English words. They're not in the Greek words. And I'm going to tell you, coincidentally, all we have is Greek for a testament of our Messiah. We don't have any Hebrew. We don't have any other language. We do have the Aramaic Peshitta, but that is questionable according to scholars. I myself believe that the Peshitta is probably legitimate and is a copy of the Hebrew. But what I can tell you is that Greek was not the language of the people. When Paul stands up in the temple court after he was arrested by the Romans, after there was a huge upheaval in the entire city of Jerusalem, this was not a few rabbis getting mad at him in the temple. It was the entire city of Jerusalem trying to kill just Paul. And very specifically, they were trying to kill him because they thought that he had brought Gentiles into the temple, which in and of itself is a violation of Torah, but we won't get into that. But then, within the confines of that actual behavior, he asks the Romans if he could speak. He speaks to them in Greek. And they say, oh, you speak Greek? You must be that rebel. No, I'm not that rebel. I'm actually one of the most famous rabbis in this region. And needless to say, these people are going to listen because why? He steps out onto the thing and starts speaking what? Not Aramaic, Hebrew. And then the whole crowd silence. All of Jerusalem silence when he speaks Hebrew. Why? Because that was the sacred language of the people. Was there a common language? You know what? They were doing all kinds of trade in all kinds of different languages. But I can tell you the sacred language, the actual preserved cultural language of the Jews of Christ's time was Hebrew. And so stop with the Aramaic, stop with the Greek, and realize that there's a coincidental problem that the entire New Testament, including the narratives of Christ's life, are in Greek. Lost again. So why is this so important? Well, we're going to get into some theory. But remember, the invisible attributes are actually qualities by which Yahweh is identified, explaining power. Power, right? His eternal power and his divine nature, which consequently, according to 1 Peter chapter 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 3, we can partake in oh yeah, you're not ready for that one, is seen through that which has been made. Okay, so now here is where it starts to become absolutely important in understanding and in magnitude of information. Okay, so let's jump to the board and let's get to it. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is talk about this dark set of letters. So beginning with, and I think I want to use orange for the Hebrew. We're just going to write this Hebrew word here, okay? And if you need reference, you can work with, for example, Isaiah 45:7. I'll just write them up here. Isaiah, where the word evil is used. In fact, let me put that in parentheses over here. Okay. And then, of course, we can do Psalm 23:1. And that is the word shepherd. Okay. Now, I know a lot of you know this already, but I'm about to hit you with some crazy stuff here. And that is that we know that this ayin, okay, this is the letter ayin. Okay, if you're looking in Psalm 119, you know that there's an entire set of verses that start with ayin. But the letter itself actually splits into two pictographs. The first pictograph is actually going to be an I. Oops. Okay, an I. Okay, ancient pictographic. I'm talking about. We find pottery shards in the area where Jericho was, and where we think we have discovered the actual original wall, and this is what we find. Okay. On the other hand, we have this. Okay. And on the one side, we have C, and by default, care. And on the other side, we have twist, and by default, dark. Okay. So now I need to take a moment and explain why this is this way. There are a number of things that are kind of the underlying or unspoken tenets of an ancient Hebrew nomad. First, and this is important, is that an ancient Hebrew nomad is known for being pastoral and not urban. What does that mean? That means that in the ancient Hebrew nomadic culture, a a a clan or a group of people who are maintaining that lifestyle just so happen to also have the behavior of not being city dwellers, but instead being country dwellers, and specifically having a context of husbandry to their behavior or lifestyle. Now, where this becomes important is in the concept or the context of a true nomad having the culture of shepherding, okay? Every single person who was a writer of the Bible, a contributor to it in some form, and what I mean by that is some spoke and others copied, right, were nomads. I can prove it. I can prove that every single last writer of the Bible was actually nomadic, and that they practiced an ancient Hebrew culture and lifestyle based upon the story that these pottery shards tell us. Okay? In other words, there was maintained from the beginning with Adam all the way to the last writer of the Protestant canon, which would be John, a contribution based upon a lifestyle and everything that pertains to it. Now, when I said that we could identify everything that we needed to understand about our Creator through that which has been made, you need to understand that that context and that concept is actually an ancient Hebrew cultural concept. We won't go too much into that today. But what I want you to understand is that when we're dealing with things like C, you need to understand it's not C as a separate piece of a puzzle per se, but instead a synergistic accompaniment of other things. Okay? Because C is not behold. Okay? So when we talk about, for example, the Hebrew who's standing on the seashore looking out over the sea and decides that it is mighty, the sun sets behind it as if it's being swallowed by it, and determines that that philosophically means that the sea has something to do with an end to order or the beginning of chaos, and then turns around and uses that philosophy within its language itself. That's the beholder. Has his hands up like, wow. And the word, the letter mem, which is a drawing of water, always represents mighty chaos, uh, uh, um, an origin of things. It's where we get the word from in Hebrew. And heaven. Okay, so now the next relevant thing is that if we are dealing with that concept of see not being behold, then we need to understand what see is in that context, and that is a shepherd seeing his sheep or caring. So behold and see are different, two different things, and that nuance is important. Because if we would have used behold in this word, it would have changed its context. But we're not using behold in this word. We're using this eye. And now what I will do is draw you a map. Okay? So that map is going to connect these two things. For example, twist is connected to Isaiah 45:7, evil, okay? And see is connected to Psalm 23. Now, where this becomes extremely important, in fact, I'm going to contextually build this in the red as well. I have my reasons for this because early on I established that red has to do with the flesh, the ego, etc. And of course, blue has to do with the spirit. And that was just my choice. It wasn't like those are truly symbolic in that way. Okay, So what we need to understand is that this word Ra appears and that, by the way, that's how you pronounce it. Let me go ahead and put that up here as well, because I think that also has a very important contextual, regional, linguistic relevance. This is the word Ra. Okay. Now, here is where it starts to become very important, and that is that this letter ayin itself, ayin in the Hebrew means I, and in the pictograph or the drawing of the letter, it means twist. In other words, the letter itself does not represent the original letter here. Okay? And, with all due respect to people who have tried to figure out how to reconcile the two, this is the truth. There were two different letters. There are not 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. There are actually 44. 22 light letters and 22 dark letters. Let me explain. And our proof is within this context right here. Okay? So, in the ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle, when you would twist goat hair, it would create a thickness. And that thickness then became easier to work with than if it was not twisted. And when they would add onto their tent, they would take old panels off of their tent and remove them because they had become worn. There was a concept of a new panel being glued to the old panel, and they would twist the fibers so that it would lay over it better. Okay? So that twisting comes from twisting the fibers. Now it's drawn as a twisted rope, which in and of itself is probably relevant and important. But what I want you to think about is the concept of how evil actually is twisted. But there's more. The Hebrew word for goat comes from that concept. Okay, the Hebrew word for darkness is the tent with the sun shining through the what we call starry night, which is basically where the sun shines through the little tiny pinholes in the tent wall. So that's kind of where we get the idea of night, of darkness, etc. The word for raven comes from the dark color of the raven. The word for evening comes from the darkness of the Hebrew word twisting. Erev is the twisted rope, the chesh, and the bait, which is what? The drawing of a twisted rope, a human head, and the tent, as if to say it has gotten too dark for man to be outside, so he's in his tent. That's evening. And so when we are working with this, you need to realize that those particular elements right there already create some sort of information that you did not know when you're reading the English Bible, where I believe it is the NIV in Isaiah 45:7 says, I, the Lord, create calamity, right? As if I bring destruction down upon the disobedient. Thank you, Marcion, for your demiurge philosophy upon our religion. Okay, so the premise is that basically what we have then is a context of see or care, shepherd, or twist, as in dark, evil. Now, we could get into all kinds of important things about the human head in this context, but we're not getting into that today. What I'm showing you is that there is an actual way in which to speak that actually has something to do not necessarily with what word is used, but how that word is used. Lost to the English concept because English doesn't have this nuance. Now, where this is really going to start to bloom is in death and life being in the power of the tongue, blessing versus curses, and the concept of glory as a weightiness applied by a human being to us, an object versus a diminishing of that same thing as a result of sound. Okay? Because remember, this lesson is about signal versus noise. Okay? So, the next thing that we need to really dive into here is how when we move vibration into the surrounding area around us, it is not about how we vibrate, but instead what our intention or our mind or consciousness behind it is. Let me explain. When we identify within the confines of the word evil, some of our former presidents have used that word to describe behavior of people when they are not doing good things but malevolent things. And that's not necessarily the context of the word evil when it is used in the Bible. And where this becomes extraordinarily important is in the context of truth versus suppression of truth. Now, where we begin to depart from the English language is when we have to use the story letters to understand our God, his attributes, eternal power, and divine nature. And furthermore, his Messiah, our Messiah, the Messiah. And furthermore, what we are and what we are actually capable of. So what I want to do is basically ask the question, and maybe I should have asked this at the beginning, if death and life are in the power of the tongue, should you speak? Because one could argue that how you say something actually creates that nuance. But that's incorrect. Although there is a bit of a pronunciation context here, which I need to get into for just a moment, it is actually more of an anthropological context. And I'm just going to explain it this way. When I say anthropological, I mean non-mystical. I mean basically human beings studying ancient civilizations and identifying evolutions of linguistic changes to a language that is accompanied by culture. So in the ancient Middle East, the ayin, as the twisted rope, was called the ga. Okay? However, that's not necessarily correct. Really, it is NGH, where we kind of get this sound, right? When we are disgusted, it is very similar in sound. So, is going to kind of be the sound, and it has a nasal a nasal tightening to it, which we're not capable as English speakers. But the way that we could really actually accomplish this is to say something like, for example, going, going, right? Going. There's that NGH sound, okay? Ng. All right. So Ra in the ancient pictographic, I'm going to do my best to pronounce this correctly. Ra in the ancient pictographic Hebrew or ancient Semitic language, which would have been close to Akkadian, Sumerian, but Mesopotamian in nature, is going to be Rog. Wrong. Okay. So in principle, that concept can create a little bit of a nuance because in the other side of that, we have ah, ah. And so on one side, we have wrong. And on the other side, we have rah. Okay. And so there was a pronunciation difference. Why this is important is because in the ancient times, if you spoke, you could say that if you pronounced it this way, it was actually going to be understood as evil. And if you pronounced it that way, it was going to be understood as shepherd, or better yet, translated friend, because it is man who watches man. Okay. But or man who watches or observes or cares, right? And so that word is sometimes translated friend and not shepherd, which I think would be more appropriate in Psalm 23. The Lord is my friend, right? But because we have that nuance of the pastoral versus the urban, it's probably translated as shepherd because of the concept of being beside still waters or being in green pastures, right? But the truth is it is a concept of friend and not necessarily some indifferent shepherd who has a necessity to care for his sheep because it's his livelihood. And we could get into the nuances of the difference between somebody who cares for sheep and doesn't care for sheep. They're still a shepherd, but you get my point. Okay. Now, where this becomes a big deal is that if in general that word resh ayin by the time of Torah is pronounced resh ayin or ra, right? Ra, and not rang, then we know that in general, again, you can't tell the difference between the pronunciations, and therefore it would be about the intention of the heart. Now, there is a lot of controversy about the shininess versus the weightiness of glory. And I'm going to propose to you that we have made a mistake within our American culture of assigning glory to some huge, unbearable shininess that we can't necessarily look upon. That probably doesn't really do it. And I'm going to propose to you also that doxa, which is the Hebrew word or the Greek word for glory, is not the same as kavod, which is the Hebrew word for glory, which consequently the word kavod has something to do with stars. In fact, I'm going to propose to you that this goes back to that context that I said at the beginning, where the Hebrew language actually has a mysticism to it, but I'm going to add a third attribute. So the first attribute is that, I'm sorry, not a third attribute. I'm going to explain a little bit of the other attributes. So the first was anthropological, that there is definitely an identification that over time language evolved as the result of cultural influences. In other words, we really don't necessarily know how to pronounce Hebrew because we went to Babylon and we kind of forgot how to speak, right? We can accept that, but that doesn't mean that it is completely dead and therefore not verifiable, like some of the Jew-hating anti-Semites who occupy the Christian and Catholic Church seem to claim. Now, it is very important that within that confine, we accept that there's also a mysticism to the language. There's a direct understanding that there was revelation or a revealing to the founders of the faith that is what is practiced today by the ancient Hebrew nomadic peoples. Yes, they were preserved. And yes, it seems as though After His Heart Ministries stumbled onto it and practices it themselves. But the concept here is that they knew things they shouldn't know. For example, let's move to one more of these. And what we're going to do is just draw this and this. That is the ancient Hebrew word koph. Q-O-P-H. Koph. And koph is the drawing of the sun on the horizon. Oh, wow, that's an amazing Z. This board sometimes, let me tell you. My penmanship is bad enough, but this board does not interpret my pen very well. Okay, drawing of the sun on the horizon. But what does it mean? Does it mean light? Let's ask, does it mean light? Does it mean horizon? Does it mean sunset? Does it mean sunrise? Guess what? It doesn't mean any of these things. It literally means condense, as in what? Become more intense through attraction. And I'll explain that in just a minute. The Hebrew word, okay, so become more intense through. This is supposed to be an R and a U. That's cute. Through attraction, okay? Attraction. And the way that I want you to think about this is the idea of gravitational condensing, okay? In fact, I'm just going to throw it up here because it is just true. Gravitational condensing. I think I spelled that right. Okay. So what we need to do is ask the question, what is gravitational condensing? Gravitational condensing is basically where something is so dense that it draws things into itself. And if there's two dense things, they draw into themselves sufficient enough that fusion occurs. Now, when fusion occurs, there's an extraordinary amount of friction involved, and that results in extraordinary amount of heat energy. Where do we actually experience that? We experience that in the tritium-deuterium isotope combination that is within the sun. The sun on the horizon, as it were, because that's when it's the biggest, right? They knew. How did they know? I couldn't tell you. But they knew that the sun was actually condensing. Now, when we think of condensation, we instantaneously identify with vaporization and the collecting of water within the vaporization. But condensing as a concept is a intensifying of locality of objects to each other. And that is an idea of being drawn together. I'm about to prove it to you. Watch this. Okay, so next page. All right, so then we have this interesting Hebrew word. Let's see, let's do this one back to this color for this part. Kof, Resh. Okay, so what do we have? We have the drawing of the sun at the horizon, right? And it means to gather or condense through traction. I don't know if I spelled that correctly. And I think by now you guys understand that my spelling is not my fine point when it comes to these teachings. Okay, so then, so on that side, we've got condense through attraction. On the other side, we've got what? A human head. This is no likeness to anybody you know, I promise. Okay? And what do we have here? We have head or man or cheek or head. Okay? So together, this word means a gathering of heads. However, it doesn't mean that. What does it mean? It means cold. Now, why would it mean cold? Why would the word har become the word cold? And where does that come from? What's the idea here? Well, again, American social democratic westernized people, you never know unless you knew the culture of the clan. Two very important things. Number one is that as a context of a completely dry environment devoid of moisture, when it begins to cool off in the evenings, it gets very cold. And I will tell you from my own wilderness survival training that you can actually get hypothermia at 50 degrees, meaning that you need to, if the temperature is at 50 degrees, somehow have a heat source or you will die. And so as a practice, as soon as the sun would begin to set, oh, isn't it lovely? As soon as the sun would begin to set, they would light a fire in the clan. Three things that were important. Number one is that if one who was a part of the clan could not see or make his way back to the camp, the fire served as a beacon, and that Hebrew word is behold the authority, or hal. And two lameds together is halal, where we get hallelujah, which is to observe the beacon in the distance and begin to move toward it. Furthermore, the fire served as a community connection. As the sun would set and the men would begin coming in from outside the camp, for whatever reasons that they had gone out, they would begin to bring report to the clan leader. This is what I observed on the horizon over here. This is what's going on with the crop over here. This is what's going on with the animals over here, right? Etc. There's a wolf pack on the western side of the bluffs, etc. That was the kara, or the community meeting, or what we have translated horribly in English, a holy convocation. And then we have the concept of that the fire itself was big enough to warm the interior of the clan area, so that the glow from the fire actually heated the front doors of the tents, and therefore they were able, that's why they have a door in the tent. You come through, you go around, and in the back part of the tent is still facing the fire side. Okay, now where this becomes important is in the fact that this does not mean gathering of heads. It's the Hebrew word for cold. So where this gets important is for you to understand that culture plays a role in how we speak. And furthermore, that the story behind the words is lost to the ideographic usage of symbols to identify phonics. When we speak, when we look and we see words and we see sentences, I'm speaking right now, I don't take the time to say there's a story behind my pronunciations. Why? Because in kindergarten, I was taught that A is ah, or possibly under certain circumstances could be ah, could be a, could be I, right? The premise is that the pronunciation of words as symbols loses its meaning and its culture as it transitions into the English language. There is absolutely no value in your heart and mind for the letter A. But in my heart and mind, I know that that particular letter was derived from something very special. Originally, it looked something, and I'm going to do left to right, even though that's probably not good. There was something kind of along these lines. Okay? And then eventually it began to develop into something along these lines. And then eventually it actually got turned on its side. And then eventually it actually got turned on its side again. And then eventually it actually arrived here. This, my friends, is the Aleph. And this, my friends, is alpha. And of course, we know it as A. But I am going to ask you, does this teach you anything about the culture of America? In any way, does it identify your people, your culture, your lifestyle choices? It does not, right? Okay. So then you understand now how raw and raw could be very important in how you were to use them if you were speaking over another. Okay? All right. Now, when we are working with the concept of alpha versus aleph, we have story versus sounding. And I just told you that sounding could be two different things. Not known. Okay. So the premise is that then that results in a context of there being a need to understand the story of your language. Well, guess what? You can't do that in English. You can't even do that in Greek because Greek is a derivation of the ancient Hebrew alphabet and Proto-Indo-European or PIE or Pi. Generally speaking, PIE is the influencer of ancient Greek, meaning that there's a language before Greek, which means Greek isn't even an original language. How interesting that our God would choose a, for lack of better words, bastardized language to describe what's happening in his story. I think not. If there was ever a singular proof that the New Testament was not written in Greek, it has to do with what values a Jew would have. For example, when Peter says that there are spirits in prison in Tartarus, that is a Greek mythological story. Meaning what? Yeah, no. He's not even supposed to have the names of other gods upon his lips. Do you see? Do you understand? I mean, even when I pronounce the word chaos, I'm actually speaking a Greek god. So, what I want you to understand is that when we put things out there, it's because of the way in which a language was influenced. We have the word chaos in our American language as describing a complete disorder, randomness, a lack of settling, etc., to describe it after the behavior of that Greek god. But there's really not a word that describes it better than that. And so I often have to use it. But what's my point? Peter didn't think that way. He wouldn't say, oh, well, you know what? Since I'm speaking Greek, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use an ancient mythological creature to describe what's happening in this particular letter I'm sending. That didn't happen. And I will propose to you that it probably doesn't even say spirits in prison in the sense of Tartarus, but something totally different in the Hebrew. And I'm going to propose to you that one of the reasons why this is so important is because that was the sacred language of the people. If you converted to the way, not Christianity, that was a derogatory term describing the way when they began to persecute the way. When that concept was being used, and I'm just going to give you an example. I'm not going to use it, but you know how the in word had to do with that people were coming from Nigeria and Benin, Africa, and the concept was that they were considered to be using that kind of that NIG sounding but not the same, eventually became the word that was used to describe the individual in America as the Negro. We know that's inappropriate and just a nuance of it. The same is true of Christian. Christian was the same. Christian was a derogatory reference to people of the way. But when they converted to the way, they did not go in speaking Greek. They went in and listened to a Hebrew person speak, and somebody interpreted for them. And they eventually began to learn the language and the culture and the lifestyle, because this right here had no value, but this does. And so as a result of that, they began to learn the story. The same is true in the sky. Yahweh wrote a story across the sky about everything and explains how to identify as a clock. At this time on the clock, this is going to happen. Revelation chapter 12. That the moon would be what? Under the feet of a woman clothed with the sun. So the sun would be within her, or at least the aura of the sun would be around her, and 12 stars at her head. Virgo. And interesting how Virgo interacts with the other constellation, which consequently, whose tail happens to contain a third of the stars of heaven. And as it descends under the horizon, and as she's moving down through there, it's September, October, which consequently is when Sukkot occurs. Just an example of a story, or symbols having a story versus symbols having a sounding and no value. Okay? Okay. So now, when we are working through a concept of the use of words and death and life being in the power of the tongue, we need to understand that glory does not mean shiny, bright, exploding, you can't handle it kind of light. However, it does in the sense of this. And what I mean by that is that they understood that gravitational condensing was how the sun produced its heat. We don't know how they knew that. I don't need to answer that question because I can just see it from the simplicity of it. But what's interesting about it is that they understood that weightiness creates attraction. And they understood that assigning weightiness to something actually created a shining of light. Weightiness in the sense of mass, because it's the greater mass that creates the attraction, that creates the fusion. And so, in principle, we need to accept that where we have lost sight of context, we have this big shiny ball in the sky, and we think that that is a concept of glory. We can't look upon it, blah, blah, blah. Well, we're right. The shininess and the inability to look upon it is definitely an attribute of it, but it's not the identity of it. The identity of it is a condensation of gravitational attraction that occurs and then creates a huge amount of heat. And heat, when it is interacting with, excuse me, heat, when it is interacting with the quantum realm, becomes light. Now, I'm not going to get into that, and I'm not going to prove to you what I just said. I don't need to, because scientists have already discovered these other realms, these other dimensions as a result of the study of quantum mechanics, and have theorized a number of significant things about light, about the intelligence of energy, etc., etc., etc. Now, when we get into the concept of death and life within the power of the tongue, we need to understand how we assign weightiness to it, okay? So, the way that I want you to think about this is that when you are within the confines of a blessing and a curse, we are dealing with the diminishing versus the expanding of um, of a concept. Okay, so the kof is um, the kof lamed is the Hebrew word that describes a curse, which is a reduction in authority. And the concept behind that whole principle has to do with, again, just like how this means cold when it actually doesn't mean cold, that cold is the concept that it was working with. And a lot of times the ancient Hebrew pictographic letter pairs create the solution to those things. In principle, one of the things that we need to kind of get our minds wrapped around is that a curse is a reduction in density. Okay. So when we are dealing with when Moses says, "Behold, I set before you a blessing and a curse, life and death, choose life that you may live," and he says, "I call heaven and earth as witness against you that I am doing this thing," and then they go and they stand on Mount Ebal and on Mount Gerizim, and they stand on Mount Ebal and they pronounce these curses, and of course there's some sort of Christian nuance that says that Mount Ebal is still dead and bare, and Mount Gerizim is still very green and lush and etc. I don't know about all that. What I do know is that when you assign weightiness to that which is a blessing, you are assigning weightiness to that which is being blessed. When you curse something, you are removing or diminishing the weightiness of that thing and therefore reducing the condensation within it, reducing the light within it, and thereby reducing the attraction within it. So the question arises then is that if you speak a curse, then one could argue that that curse that you are speaking is removing density from the particular thing, the person, place, or thing. Because we know, for example, Josiah was prophesied by the man of God who was eventually killed by the lion when he walked up to the altar that was in the valley of, was it the valley of Hinnom? I can't remember which valley it was. Let that go. He walks up the altar, says, "You're cursed." And the altar breaks apart and spills out its ashes. And he says that a king will come along and plow you and turn you upside down so that there won't even be any value to the land anymore. And that he would turn you into a dunghill or something along those lines. I might be getting the two stories mixed up. But the point being is that when he cursed that object then responded to him. Now, in Proverbs, it says that just like a dove, a curse does not alight upon the innocent. And, I'm sorry, just like a dove, a flitting dove, so also is a curse with the innocent. And what that means is that if a curse does not have merit by which to rest upon something, then a diminishing will not occur. However, if you do speak a curse over something, then in that context, it is very important to understand that that means that you are speaking a diminishing over that thing. Now, within the confines of the law of reciprocation and Yeshua's statements about judge not lest you be judged, if you curse, whatever decision that caused you to curse something in the first place, and by the way, I'm not talking about swearing, I'm not talking about the SH word or the F word or any of that stuff. I'm talking about speaking a diminishing over something. Okay. And in a minute, I'm going to show you that that doesn't have to be with words. Okay. But the premise is that as that occurs and that diminishing begins to occur, the identity of that thing changes from something that is weighty to something that is not weighty. And we know that the concept of glory or weightiness being assigned to something has something to do with the level of attraction that occurs, but also the level of density, and therefore the level at which it intensifies. In other words, abundance is based upon a gravitational condensation in the supernatural realm, whereas the opposite occurs with a curse. Now, Yeshua says, judge not lest you be judged, for what measure you judge someone is the measure by which you will be judged. He doesn't say don't judge. He says if you do, how you choose to measure that judgment is going to be the result of the same measurement that you have to judge yourself. But guess what? It's not you that's going to be the judgment. It's not you that's going to get to decide that thing. So in principle, then we can accept that if words have the ability to create formation within the confines of a diminishing versus an intensifying, then we can accept that there's a whole nother level of response from the universe at large to our words. And this is where it gets intriguing, because there are those who say that we are separated in the sense that God is out here and we are here, and that we don't have any of those divine elements. And yet Second Peter chapter 1, verse 3 says we can what? We can operate within the confines of the divine nature if we escape the world through lust. Now, I'm not going to get into the nuances or the Kabbalistic elements of those statements, but what I am going to do is explain to you that that divine nature is the same thing Paul mentioned. It's the same word being used there. It's theotes. That divine nature is being mentioned by Paul in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, when he says, you are without excuse because that which has been made tells us about those things. We go back to the concept of the sun and weightiness and gravitational pull, and we identify that the denser an object is, the more that it will attract things to it. And we identify that the less dense that an object is, the less it will attract things to it. We start to accept that when we, with words, create a formation of diminishing upon an object, a person, or a land, then we understand that that diminishing is actually a reduction in density. There will be a spreading out and a sparsing that occurs. We see that within the narrative of the Tower of Babel, in which we identify and see that within the Tower of Babel, there was a belief that they needed to what? To have their own city and a name for themselves so that they would not be scattered. Okay. So when we talk about the idea of weightiness and attraction and intensity and all those other things, and of course we could get into electromagnetism, we could get into all the nuances of nuclear physics, but in the end, what more we need to identify is that this ancient people understood this concept in a way that we don't. Now, this is where this becomes important. There is something called angular momentum. And angular momentum is basically where instead of something going in a straight line, it goes at an angle, okay? And as it goes at an angle, it begins to go around in a circle. Angular momentum is actually rotation. Angular momentum is the result of a context of vortex process. If you begin with an object speaking, if you begin with an object moving air through a round object, it will tend to follow the roundness of that object as it is going. Let me show you what I mean here on the board. So the premise is that generally speaking, let's say that we have this thing here and it is on wheels and it is about to go down this hill. In fact, maybe I should draw that a little bit different here. Actually, you know what? No, I'm going to keep it this way. Okay. So the premise is that if we give it a push, right, we are going to cause it to move, and that is moving at that, it's moving in a linear fashion. So we'll call this linear. Okay. And in context, we're moving in a straight line. But if we start to create any type of curve, then it starts to experience some physics, specifically forces pulling against it to try to keep it in a straight line. Now, the premise here is that as that occurs, then eventually we are looking at that if it was to continue in that straight line without any interruption, it would go around in a circle. So that's the concept of angular momentum without me being able to illustrate it in 3 dimensions. But I could tell you that if we were to look at it in 3 dimensions, it would look something like this. Okay, that's basically what we would see if it was in 3 dimensions. In other words, we would see a helix. And I did a double helix because I know that there is definitely a necessity to understand that vibration has a connection to the actual molecular structure of our DNA. Everything vibrates, okay? But where this becomes important is that if you move air through a tube, okay, at an angle based upon a certain vibration, it will follow a path of that. And the result is that the air will create a cyclone of energy or a vortex. Now, anytime that we stop that air, that spinning stops, okay? So now let me see if I can explain this in a way that you could understand it. When we speak, for example, in English, through stops and vowel points and aspirations of those stops. Even if we have aspirations of sound, right? Breath moving, because we've stopped vibrating our voice at that moment, we are creating stops. For example, a P or a B or an M or an N, I'm sorry, not an N, an F, all have to do with your lips stopping vibration. What I mean by that is does not have a sound to it. Does not have a sound to it. B has a sound to it, but it stops. V has a sound to it, but it stops. Okay, that's a consonant and it's stopping the sound. Now, where this becomes important is that vowels do not have stops. Okay, A, E, I, O, U don't stop unless we stop them. And what that means is that we create these small little vortexes in the air, and until we put a stop to it, it is just out there. And what I mean by that is that as we begin to speak, we are creating these little vortex energies, but as we stop them, we bookend them. And that's what creates the sounding that eventually becomes words. Okay? Now, we could get into all kinds of discussions about the origin of words and soundings and all those things, especially when we find that there were 70 nations present at the time of the Tower of Babel, and there were 70 original languages according to CIA Factbook. Those 70 original languages all contain a very similar thing: nasal, guttural, labial, dental. And when I say labial, I mean lips, dental, stops, and aspirations. So no matter what, all that happened at Babel is they started creating stops in a different place. Okay? That's all. Because the human's mouth can only create vowel soundings according to the wideness or narrowness of the mouth. Right? And so in principle, then, we can understand that those little tiny little vortexes that are being put out into the atmosphere are shaped by stops. Now, when we accept that the ancient understanding was that which we see in front of us is that which we can't see, we accept that what is known is that which is not known, which is what Paul said in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, that we are without excuse, that everything we need to understand about God is right in front of us. Then we can accept that this is also how the creator of the universe created what he created. Now, where this becomes important is when we accept that everything has vibration, everything has energy, and everything has a frequency. And we accept that when we begin to vibrate a sound at the same sound at which something vibrates, it intensifies. And when we begin to vibrate at a sound contrary to that which something is vibrating at, we affect change upon that thing. So the way that I want you to think about this is that when we are creating words, when we're speaking words, it is not about the words we say per se, but instead about what is behind the heart of the word that's being said. Let me explain in a way that you could understand it. When we talk about something where somebody says, I love you. Oh, actually, you know what? I don't want to use that one. I want to use God bless you. So a person sneezes and instantaneously we say, God bless you. Now, that's a custom that when you work it out is actually potentially a little bit inappropriate, but that rabbis have identified as probably something we shouldn't be doing. And I also teach this, in that we can't really accept the original cultural decision to say those words. Now, I know that sounds off the wall, because why wouldn't you say God bless you to somebody? Why are you saying it in the first place? You don't know why you say God bless you to somebody who sneezes. You think you do. You may say, oh, well, wasn't there something ancient thing about when you sneeze, you lose control of your body or something like that, and that's when a demon can enter? Yes and no, because there's more to that, where there's a belief that your soul leaves your body when you sneeze. Okay. So now the premise is that this is an example. Somebody sneezes, they could be totally atheist and say, God bless you, unless they're intentionally trying to practice not doing that. The premise is that when somebody sneezes, we say, God bless you, but we don't actually mean it. What I mean by that is that we don't make the choice to identify that we want to assign weightiness that was granted to us to assign to things because of who we are. It was granted to us to assign things. I'm going to give you that information in a minute. But the premise is that it was granted to us to assign weightiness to things. And if we assign weightiness to things, then they increase in density. And that means they attract things, and therefore they experience abundance. That's blessing. So in principle, you form out of your vortex energy speaking mechanism, your vortex energy producing mechanism, formations of those quote unquote blessings or those quote unquote curses. But where this becomes important is in that the heart behind the words that are being said. You say, God bless you, but you don't even actually know what a blessing is. You don't know the level at which you are wanting to actually give weightiness to somebody who you don't even know what their behavior or acts are. What I mean by that is you're walking down the street, somebody walks past you and they sneeze. You say, God bless you. And now you have removed, because you said those words, you have removed a discipline or a nuance of reciprocation off of them as a result of the fact that they have done something wrong and they are experiencing hardship. And you just added weightiness to them, thus interfering with that balancing mechanism. Now, that's an extreme case, and I'm not claiming that that's necessarily what's going on, but truth be told, is you use those words, you say those things, obviously, under the right circumstances, that's what's occurring. However, most of the time, it's just an empty statement, which means there is no value behind it. And if you assign value to something that has meaning, then it actually has outcome that is identifiable. If you assign value to expectation, that is something that is not identifiable because we don't know the future. And according to Hebrew thought, the future doesn't even exist except that which we actually make it. Now, I know that sounds a little bit off the wall, but what I want you to think about is when Yahweh tells the ground in the third day to bring forth trees yielding seed that would have the fruit within them that would yield seed. When Yahweh says that, I should say, when the source of all things or the creator says that, he's actually telling the ground to do it. So by what authority and by what power does the ground have that ability, except that which was granted to it by Yahweh in the first place as an Elohim? The ground itself is an Elohim. It creates life. The trees, right? The shrubs, the grass, etc. You say, now wait a minute, the creator made those things. No, the creator enabled the ground to do it through the power and authority to do it, which consequently has something to do with the idea that energy has an intelligence enough to know how it is supposed to work. We see this true and proof of the double slit experiment, which consequently a lot of people have challenged, and a lot of people have tried to come up with explanations about how and why the energy, when it is observed, acts a certain way, and when it isn't observed, it acts a certain way. I'm not going to get into that, because if you lose the context of the idea, then you are not operating within the confines of the concept. What do I mean by that? Fine. We've got critics who say, oh, well, energy actually isn't intelligent. But then we claim that there's this intensification of all power in the universe that is not flesh. We know that. We know it is not, doesn't have a physical locality. In fact, if we get into systematic theology, which is a theory taught within the late undergraduate and early graduate levels of seminary school identify that the creator is omnipresent or is everywhere, and of course is omniscient in that it knows everything, and it is omnipotent in that it is all powerful. We need to somewhere along the lines accept that that is an intelligent energy. An energy that is connected to a context of emotion, an energy that is connected to a context of cognition, and an energy that is connected to a context of movement. Paul even says, in him we live and move and have our being. And so it's interesting that in that context, he was actually quoting a Greek philosopher who believed that concept. Now, where this is very important is in the idea that when we are working with energy or vibration, we are working with potential versus a different kind of energy. In fact, I can't remember the equation, but the equation that sets the stage for everything is that potential energy plus the other energy is the full energy. And the principle is that potential energy is energy that has not yet been translated into something like sound or vibration. Of course, sound is vibration, or kinetic energy where something is moving, but again, we get back to vibration. And so in the end, what we'll find is that there is an energy that is not yet tapped into, and there's an energy that has already been converted into other things. And the combination of the two equate all of the energy in the universe. Well, one of the places where this starts to become important is in the idea that the heart behind the production of the energy as an Elohim, where we are empowered by something greater than us to accomplish a task that it is not actually accomplishing, but we are accomplishing. When it says, let the land bring forth in the English, that principle is that the land itself is accomplishing the task, not the creator themselves. Now, where this becomes extremely important is when you accept that you are actually an Elohim. Now, we don't need to get into all the stuff where your Messiah said you were, the psalmist said you were, etc., etc. What we need to get into is the context of a principle that we would be empowered and enabled to create a vibrational energy that is vortex based, that creates formation. Okay. Now, where this becomes extremely important is in the fact that when he did this, he did not create an unlimited amount of infinite or indeterminate context. What I mean by that is that in what area of process of vibration occurs, there is an attempt by something that we can't explain that causes something to make vibration, heat, chemicals, everything become equal. Okay? So in that sentiment, then, there's a concept that when Moses says, behold, I've set before you life and death, a blessing and a curse, you could conclude that those are balancing opposites. Now, where do we have kind of a proof of this is when it says, do not rejoice in the calamity of your enemy, lest that curse alight off of him. or fly away. Now, that principle then means that there is an intention or purpose or process behind cursing in the first place. So let's address this, okay? Because this is something that unfortunately Christianity has become professionally disgusting with. And when I say professionally, I mean people have actually used their authority as teachers of religion to actually activate a cultural movement of choice to judge. Okay, so let's talk a minute first about curses. So generally speaking, if you are charismatic, you believe that a prophet filled with the Holy Spirit, prophesying, is going to pronounce some sort of future calamity upon a wicked individual. Now, if you are in the other realm of non-charismatic, that's kind of a little bit different story because you believe that that's not possible anymore, quoting Hebrews chapter 1, quoting a number of other verses to try to indicate that that's not a power anymore. Now, there is also people who say that anybody who believes as a charismatic believes is actually neurotic. In fact, I think it was Freud who was one of the people that said that. Whereas Jung, who was a mystic and a Kabbalist, who was kind of Freud's opponent, said, yeah, no, actually, it's the people who do not have this belief who are neurotic. Anyways, the point being is those who choose to believe that there is still a power is actually whom I'm speaking with, because those of you who choose not to are already in grave error. And as we continue to discover more and more about the quantum realm and about the concept of tunneling and entanglement and ascension, descension, condensation versus dissemination, there is going to always be a revelation of more truth that aligns with the Word of God than not. Okay? Okay. So in that sense, it is important to understand that most charismatics believe that prophets come along, they speak some future calamity over a people as a result of them somehow being quote unquote disobedient to God. But the truth is, the truth is that number one, it takes a long, long time before that even is a reality. What do I mean by that? I mean that every prophet that you read about in the Bible spoke something, and it wasn't until years later that there was actually a calamity befall those people. What kind of sick and demented person accepts that a man of God could go to Israel from Judah, curse an altar, return, be invited in when he was told not to be invited in, and as a result be killed by a lion? Except that you don't completely understand the story. You say, oh, well, the wrath of God, he wasn't obedient or whatever. You know what? If you had even one inkling of that level of judgment upon your life, you'd be dead right now. Okay? I'm just going to put that out there. You have no idea the level of violation you are in with the creator of the universe if you think that way. Okay? So that's one thing right off the bat that we need to dispense with. Is there a concept that God has this wrath over a people because of their disobedience, and that is why the calamity falls, and the result is that basically he has this kind of this hardness towards them because he's holy? That's what the pulpit teaches. But the premise is that when we really actually start to look at the prophets, we will find that number one, Curses were very, very rare compared to the level of rectification that was requested or offered. And furthermore, there was a concept that if there was a determination, for example, Lot in the city of Sodom, it says in Peter that Lot's righteous soul was vexed daily by the behavior of the Sodomites. Now, what's really important here is that the Sodomites themselves were doing things that most cities in the entire world at that time or now were doing. The exploitation of children, the exploitation of women, the killing of babies, and the general practice of sexual immorality. Those things in and of themselves supposedly are what got Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed. But what's interesting is that we see practices of those things to this day and throughout history. Just like we see people violating the Sabbath, even by going out and picking up sticks. And I will tell you, I myself, when I have been camping and have been camping on the Sabbath, and it has been below 50 degrees, am aware that I need to create a fire and very possibly didn't realize that it was going to be that cold and therefore have to go gather because I didn't know that that was going to be that cold and I need to protect my family from that cold. Now, my point being is that these stories you don't understand because you are not a Hebrew, and I'm not trying to insult you. That is a naivety that is present within Christianity that could, under certain circumstances, lead to serious error because of judgment. Let me give you an example. What is the single most practiced discussion and or voicing of a Christian with somebody who they don't know? What is the first thing they're going to do? They're going to test. Are you saved? Has there been a time where you have accepted Jesus as Lord of your life? Right? And then they want to hear your testimony because they want to test and see whether or not it's true, because they know that people, what? People will say yes, so they'll leave them alone. So then now they've tested to determine whether or not they are quote unquote saved from the condemnation of eternal conscious punishment of hell. In other words, they're going to say, okay, let me make sure that this person isn't going to hell. Let me make sure that their testimony, what? Meets my standard. But then the question arises is, does your testimony meet someone's standard? Oh, and then it gets better because now as they start to observe behavior, they may or may not still believe. Oh, I found out about this person's past. And truth be told is that right there is proof that what they're saying right now can't be true. Right? Or furthermore, they may say something like, you know what? I'm just gonna treat this person a certain way because you just never know. And yet at the same time expect the creator of the universe to approve of and overlook behavior that falls under the confines of abominable acts within the Tanakh itself. For example, unjust weights and measures as a concept of determining whether upon which someone should be cursed or blessed. What do I mean by that? I mean deciding that a person is a good person and therefore blessing them. Deciding that someone is a bad person and cursing them. Yet at the same time, the level of measure by which you decide that somebody should receive a curse, and let me help you understand. Gossip is cursing. Let me explain. Gossip ruins the reputation of a person. And by ruining the reputation of a person, you make it more difficult for them to actually access success, thereby diminishing their life. You're either going to say something like, oh, I'll bet they're doing this, which is absolute filth. In fact, it says, a lying tongue is an abomination to the Lord. Proverbs chapter 6. And therefore, in that same context, I bet they're doing this is actually ruining their reputation, but also creating that lie and thereby diminishing them. A curse. Oh, but what if they actually did do it? Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Number one, and this is important. There are sins unto death and sins not unto death, according to John chapter 5. I'm sorry, 1 John chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. We find that there seems to be a consequence of that is identified for certain behaviors of death, even within the Torah itself. But what is important to know is that before you make that type of an accusation, you need to be prepared to be the one who doles out the punishment. For example, let's say that somebody had a rumor that someone had committed adultery. Okay? So they say, oh yeah, you know what? This person committed adultery. Now, here's the part that's really important. Number one, and this is very, very relevant, if you were to say that someone had committed adultery, number one, you as your own witness yourself could not continue any further. But let's say two people made that accusation, and then after they made that accusation, it was proven to be true. Do you know who has to actually kill the people? You. And I'm just going to put out there that when Yeshua raised the bar a little bit and said, even if you look with lust upon a woman, you have already committed adultery. I'm going to propose to you that if that be true, then one could argue that the universe as a mechanism of response to human behavior, which we're just now learning about in science, actually looks upon that as the same and therefore begins to determine a diminishing or a death upon you. Oh, then I'm going to take it a step further. If you have a measurement by which you decide that somebody is worthy of a blessing or worthy of a curse, and that measurement is different for the next person because they're your relative, your friend, somebody you trust, somebody you believe in, etc., then you need to understand that's unjust weights and measures. That's also an abomination to God. Yes, you're now falling into a category that you do not want to be in. Now, where this becomes important is when we realize then that there are times where we use words to try to diminish people when actually we're not willing to even believe that we fall into that category. I'm going to prove it to you. Watch this. World view. The word world view that is used by Christians. I have a Christian worldview. Oh, really? So then who are you viewing and why? Right? Oh, well, I'm viewing non-believers. How do you determine that they're a believer? According to the Nicene Creed and all of that criteria? Because that definitely establishes whether a person is saved or not. Oh, but let's get into the concept of salvation itself. Do you know what that means? If it means you think that you're being delivered from hell or that you've somehow excused yourself from hell, you need to understand that hell is actually a very number one, nuanced language problem, and B, a very, very doctrinally unsound teaching. And what I mean by that is that it is a construct or a creation designed around creating fear and creating a determination or willingness for people to comply to rules and laws by stating that if they don't, they will fall into destruction. For example, the concept of absolution, that you would not have to go through purgatory and you could go actually to heaven. As I understand absolution, maybe you have a different definition of absolution. If one is caught being idle on the seventh day, like the Jews are, they shall have no absolution. Council of Laodicea, I believe it's 336 AD. That's right. The church itself decided that if you actually keep the seventh day Sabbath, like the Jews do, you will go to hell. Okay, so we understand then that there's probably some things we need to probably be careful of. But let's get back to the concept of gossip. Let's get back to the concept of making accusations just flippantly. Let's get back to the concept of deciding that a person does not actually deserve something, or that somebody actually needs to fall into calamity as a result of a belief about them, versus a person who you believe who should go into abundance as a result of a belief about them, when you don't know their secrets and you also don't know what their heart is actually toward you. You see, that's the mistake within the confines of judging, okay? So what do we have here? We have a concept or an idea that, first of all, we act like creators with our mouths, just like the creator did in day 3 when he told the land to do a certain thing. How do we know? Because that same land was put under the dominion of Adam and his sons in verse 28. Let them have dominion over the earth. Let the earth bring forth trees yielding seed within them. You see now where we have dominion over the land, just like the Creator did in that context. So now when you go and you curse a land, you create a diminishing of that land's process, which would result in famine, in pestilence, etc. Now, it does say that the land itself has a reaction to behavior. For example, when the Samaritans came into the land, the Samaritans were actually Elamites who were brought into the land of Israel from Elam, and Israel was taken to Elam. That's where the palace of Susa was, where, of course, the story of Esther occurs. But when they're taken into that land and the other people are brought in, immediately wild beast, pestilence, and the poisonous plants, and there was a number of other things I can't remember that were going on with them, and they contacted the king and said, "Hey, you brought us to a cursed land." Well, who cursed it? Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, right? But how long did that take? And how many times did Yahweh give them a chance? How many times did that happen? So when you have calamity fall upon you within days of you doing a bad behavior, you need to check yourself. You need to look and say, you know what? How much mercy did God show Israel over what amount of time? Right? And maybe kind of unhook yourself from the belief that he's just constantly spinning his wheels trying to get us to be obedient to him. And when we're not, he's going to smack doodle us, right? Instead, what I want you to identify is that there are times where Yahweh takes a prophet, sets him in a circumstance so that he can observe the injustices. Go read Ezekiel chapter 22. There's a few things that are important about Ezekiel chapter 22. Number one, Ezekiel was not actually in the land. The land had already gone through a number of exiles, and he was basically observing in the spirit. We're going to leave that alone for now, but the context was is that he was, for lack of better words, remote viewing the behavior in Jerusalem. Ezekiel 22 is an observation and a prophecy about that, where basically he is observing these things going on, and as a result of it makes a determination. Then, of course, the curse is pronounced, and the information that is presented is the siege against Jerusalem, etc., right? Okay, but the point behind this is that all the different behaviors that Ezekiel did, right? The Ezekiel 4:9 bread, which we have on the shelves in the grocery store, but was a curse, right? The his belt, his nakedness, his laying on his side for a certain amount of days, and laying on his side on his other side for a certain amount of days. All those things that are part of the presentation of these curses are predicated by his observation of the injustice by being in those circumstances, observing them. Meaning that if you are positioned in a place in which you observe injustices, and your identity is actually already been established, and you are operating within the confines of he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. In other words, that you are not identifying merit, but instead injustice. It is your obligation to pronounce judgment. You observe an injustice that is enumerated in Torah, and you determine that that injustice is something that needs to be intervened, you pronounce curse. You create a vortex energy that the universe would be obedience to, that reduces and diminishes the glory within that land, that people, that person, that object. Okay? In the same way, if you are positioned in a situation in which you observe the actual opposite of injustice and a preservation of justice, then you pronounce blessing, in which the creator of the universe will take a knee to rise a person, place, or thing up through an intensity of attraction, through density of weightiness that you, as a son of Adam, have been given the power to bring about. Now, the dangers of this fall within the confines of the heart, in which you don't determine justice according to, you don't determine injustice according to a general measurement, but instead what you've decided is not right or fair, versus what Torah says, or better yet, what is warned in Torah that should not be practiced, like a politician, judge, or minister taking a bribe. Maybe I should say prophet. Read Ezekiel 22 and identify what you actually need to see and deal with. However, be prepared that if you in any way believe that your blessing or curse upon your life is merited, whether to the negative, I don't deserve, or to the positive, I have a right to, you will fall under that same judgment. And as a result, will have to be tempted. No temptation is seized you except that which is common to man. If you determine that a person has done a certain thing and they need to be punished, and you begin to pronounce curse either through words of gossip or through the heart of venting or through other things, then you need to understand that same determination will fall upon you if it's based upon merit. If it's not based upon just measurement, then you will fall under it. And if you yourself have not practiced it, you will fall into temptation of it so that you can demonstrate that you can overcome it, A, and B, that it is not actually merit by which you've determined. Now, I have seen this play out in my own life in its own way, and I can tell you, I have observed injustices, called that curse, observed that curse actually fall upon that people, person, or that person, place, or thing. And I can tell you it's real. It's a reality, but it needs to fall within the confines of not a negative or positive view of that person, place, or thing. And as a result, we have a problem because if it's politically motivated, religiously motivated, or any other type of bias that could cause you to not determine it correctly, but instead be emotionally attached to it, again, you will fall under that same measurement. And if you yourself don't practice it, you will be tempted within it. There is a huge danger behind it, but there is an absolute obligation to it. So now we have the concept of church discipline, and then we will finish. There's this idea and belief that the church has a right to remove people from their fellowship as a result of their observation of that behavior. And there's also a concept, and that comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where we see an immoral act, a violation of Torah occurring, and Paul determining that that person should no longer be a part of their fellowship and be turned over to Satan, who consequently is not some external entity that is trying to destroy your soul and drag you to hell. But when he says, turn them over in that way, in 2 Corinthians, he says, I may have said that a little bit harshly. Make sure you restore him. Oh, y'all ain't not, you guys, you can't handle this. Because what you actually need to do is do your best to actually offer an opportunity for them to return to fellowship. This concept of shunning, of disfellowship, of kicking people out, and then you're just done with them unless they meet your standard. Oh, baby, you have no idea the level of fire you're actually calling upon your community, your people. If a prophet is positioned within the confines of a circumstance by which he observes a violation of Torah and a dereliction of the duties of the sons of Adam to do the right thing in the way it is enumerated in Torah, he has the obligation, not right, and empowerment to bring a diminishing upon that land, people, or thing. And if he, in that same way, is positioned in such a way that the opposite occurs, he has not the right, but the obligation to lay weightiness upon that person, place, or thing in such a way that it will begin to create gravitational pull that would draw in abundance, because The more dense it becomes, the more intense it becomes, the more light comes from it. There is a concept that is cyclical within Torah that if you begin to operate within the light, more light will be attracted to you. And as that occurs, more light will be poured out. It's the concept in Kabbalah of receiving in order to give. You receive more in order to give more. You don't receive more because of yourself. You receive more because you can distribute more. This ministry will grow when you begin to think that way. Not only that, but the change that this world needs is suppressed by the scarcity mentality that you are to receive in order to be comfortable. But instead, you are to receive in order to distribute equally. And that equal distribution cannot be contained within unjust weights and measures. If you have determined that someone is not saved and therefore you're not going to fellowship with them, and you have determined that somebody is not, whose behavior appears to violate your, for lack of better words, Christian sentiments about what a good Christian is, I would be very careful, because you can lose property, life, sanity, your family, your friends, your community as a result of laying that judgment. You say, I am able to determine because I am a Christian whether or not somebody is saved. You are wrong. And also, you don't even know what salvation is because you're still buying into the Augustinian lie of hell that poor Luther struggled with so badly. He used to lock himself in a room and pray and cry and scream and yell for fear that he was going there. So I think it's important for you to understand, number one, historical elements of our faith are extremely important. Number two, that there was never an intention to retain Torah observance within the confines of the actual Roman Catholic Church or the Roman Universal Church. Furthermore, there was never any intentions to maintain the cultural truth behind the original lettering system itself. This was never intended by those who have determined what your doctrine is. This was intended. We'll just vibrate our mouths instead of having a story behind why we vibrate our mouths. And do you see the danger there? You're assigning value to expectation and not value to meaning. This has meaning, this does not. And because of that fact, we have lost the ability to know how powerful the vibrations coming out of here into here really are. And furthermore, we have forgotten the obligation to justice. And we have forgotten the reality that you cannot turn a blind eye. And if you do, you yourself fall under that same judgment. We know that from what is it, Leviticus chapter 5? Do you see now how dangerous it is to run your mouth and think you know everything? Determine the condition of a person's soul. Determine the condition of a person's merit. Determine the condition of a person's redemption or his salvation or his ability to change. Oh, and then it gets even better. Determine whether they are worthy even of Christ. You have no idea the level of nuance, of balancing equilibrium is operating in your life because of your mouth. And you think that when James says that the tongue turns the ship and that somehow, or the tongue is like the turning of a ship, and that somehow is related to just doctrinal communication, or worse yet, to saying curse words like the SH word or the F word, you have erred so extraordinarily seriously that the universe itself is actually operating against you, even though that you merit every blessing that's coming towards you. Your mouth has canceled it with your curses. But at the same time, you need to be aware that the blessing and a curse pronounced by Moses is absolutely mandatory and not a choice. If you observe the injustices of Torah, like Ezekiel did in Ezekiel 22, you have to curse. But be very afraid. Because if you curse as a result of a belief that something that would be measured by one person a certain way versus measured by another, oh my gosh, you have no idea the level of health that is going to fail in you, the level of financial woe that is going to fall upon you, etc. Because when you curse a land, a people, or an object, you need to know that now carries your vibration as long as that is present. And when you bless, somebody's walking down the street, God bless you. Although there is an element of intention that we need to understand. Remember that word raw versus raw. There's no difference in the sounding. So you say God bless you versus when you actually do it with your heart. There's no difference in the sounding. It's actually the intention itself, which of course we've discovered in the quantum realm actually responds. Intention, expectation responds. So when you place value upon meaning, like here, versus value upon meaning like here, versus value upon expectation like here, you are creating regardless. So diminishing occurs as the result of how you determine things versus diminishing or versus intensification occurs on how you determine things. And that cannot be the result of a merit that you have decided is present within the confines of behavior, words, attitudes, but instead within the confines of a violation of Torah, which means you need to return to the foundation of how that's determined. Because if you miss it, you might mistakenly bring upon yourself the calamity you have determined for someone else. Because here's what it says: a curse, like a dove, flies away from the person who is not guilty. Right? Meaning a curse only falls upon the guilty. What if you're guilty? What if the determination that you have identified for another is actually secretly and privately measured against you? Prepare yourself, my friend, because I can tell you that that is going to fall upon you in the same measurement. It's a very difficult thing. It is, because you have to figure out when you are actually supposed to judge and when you are actually supposed to curse. And I can tell you, your pulpit authorizing you to determine those things the way that it has is not it. But there is definitely something that says if you observe this thing and you don't do anything about it, the curse will fall upon you too. Okay? So when we begin to talk about church discipline, in which we kick somebody out because we've gone with another brother and tried to restore them and they didn't listen, and so then it went before the council of the church and now they didn't listen and therefore kick them out. You need to go read 2 Corinthians, because he in there says, I spoke these harsh words. Now I withdraw them. Restore that man. Oh my gosh, the sickness of this country and the sickness of the church and the sickness of human beings to determine what should happen to them, etc., etc. If you understood the level at which we are in violation, you would understand the level at which we are actually suffering and have disassociated from it. You drive to work and don't even know that you drove there because you don't want to know how bad off we really are. And you don't want to know how much that's just an equilibrium occurring. Everything is equilibrium. You need to understand the very balance of a human being to be able to stand up is actually hydrostatic equilibrium, in which liquid in their ears is actually identifying whether they're balanced or not. The earth itself, the crust itself, is trying to balance out in a liquid form. Your body itself, in its chemicals, its hormones, etc., is trying to balance out. So don't think for a second that your behavior in trying to determine whether or not someone has the merit to have a blessing or a curse is going to go unnoticed by those same mechanisms that we know are just manifestations. No, that's not the right word. Are just materializations of upper vibration energies. In other words, when Yeshua is arguing with the woman at the well and says, no, you are wrong in your thinking because God is spirit and we will worship him in spirit and truth. And it doesn't matter whether it's here in Jerusalem or here in Samaria, does not matter. You're missing the point. What he was trying to say is that we're not dealing with a material God. We're not dealing with hands and feet and eyes and ears, right? The eyes of the Lord go to and fro, looking for someone who was good and found none. And Paul says, there is not one good, not one. Okay, he's quoting the psalm, but what you're missing is that it's not about the material realm. It's not about this physical realm. It's about something higher, and we know that higher vibration results in less mass, less material existence. And so the result of that is that we can identify that these higher vibration realms are doing the same exact thing we are in the same exact way, but as an energy. Where that becomes dangerous is when we accept that those energies are actually doing spiritual equilibrium adjustments. That should concern you. If there was ever an identification of a quote unquote fear of God, it would be that thing. It would be that you need to understand that everything is actually trying to balance out. Because the ultimate balancing is actually Yeshua, who is the combination of the severity and the kindness of God as a manifestation, no, as an emanation of compassion, which is a observation and awareness of somebody's state of calamity and a strong desire to remove them from it. You don't have the strong desire to remove them from it. In fact, this identification that someone should be blessed and you have no idea what they actually are doing is an example of this, which means justice is actually the core of everything. An observation of justice and social injustice is actually the intention behind Torah in the first place. So where this becomes important is in your own everyday life, in which you begin to think that you are actually determining the outcome correctly. You have identified a behavior and you think that you need to curse it or you need to bless it, and that not necessarily is the observation. Don't get me wrong, God positions his prophets in circumstances by which that blessing or curse is going to occur. That's why Moses said it in the first place. So where this becomes extremely important is to realize that in your operation of your everyday life, you need to be making determinations in the right way and be identifying things in the right way, because if you're not, then you need to understand what's going to happen, which means you need to have a knowledge of Torah in a Hebrew sense, in an ancient Hebrew nomadic story-based value, so that you can actually determine and know the actual outcome and its importance. So when we are dealing with that system, we need to understand that there is a purpose behind it, but also we need to understand that it is at the core of what governs us. The problem with Christians who believe that the Torah was done away with is they removed the standard. And now it becomes about what they think is actually right or wrong. And they will determine that. And unfortunately, that's resulted in some people being alienated in such a way that I could tell you that if they cried out to Yahweh in any way, the hammer would probably come down. Not because he's a wrathful God and he wants to deal with you because you're a naughty person. I mean, that whole thing about God chastises those he loves, that's a bad interpretation of that Greek. What you need to develop in your understanding is that he doesn't diminish those he loves. He diminishes those who hate him. And according to Torah, those who hate him are those who violate his commandments. That's dangerous. So what's the outcome of all this? What's the importance of all this? Number one, as an American, you have a challenge in front of you. You cannot interpret the Bible in your language, which means you can't determine doctrine. You cannot decide how something is supposed to be played out. You can't even determine your closeness to God through the English language in the English Bible. Sure, it says that Paul says, I am persuaded that neither height nor depth, but angel nor principality nor any other thing can separate you from the love of God. Okay, fine, but you don't even know what the word love means. And you don't even know what the word separation means. And you don't even know how Rabbi Shaul or Paul actually was using those things. You don't even know the letter that caused Paul to write the letter to the Romans in the first place. We don't know the questions that were asked. We don't know why he was responding the way he was. But I can tell you that there's enough information that the Greek is Hebrew nuanced enough to prove that it was not written in the Greek. Now, where this becomes controversial is in the fact that I am actually claiming that unless you begin to develop a Hebrew lifestyle and seek guidance from somebody who understands that Hebrew lifestyle so that you can begin to change your behavior and thinking as an American, you actually are operating within a religion that is completely derelict of the instruction and approval of God. And you need to know that going to church on Sunday and singing and waving your hands is your emotional attachment. And it has nothing to do with the spiritual at all. It is just your emotions that you experience, chemical responses in your body as a result of conditioning, because the pastor has told you how you're approved of God and how you're not. And the pastor has told you how you have a relationship with God and how you don't, out of an English Bible in an American social democratic westernized schooling and or training from the result of other being in church already, that never ever encroaches upon the level of mystic relationship between the human and the energy of the intensification of all power in the universe and the personality of the creator itself. And unfortunately, the result is that people have been killed. People have been tortured. people have been treated a certain way as a result of a belief that is not accurate to the actual original story. And furthermore, people have been treated a certain way, and people are in a certain state as a result of that they don't even realize they're in because of their disassociation, which was a plan from the beginning. So as a result of that, I think it is very important for you to know that if you don't begin to seek instruction on how to un-Americanize yourself in your faith, you will err all the way to destruction. And when I say destruction, I don't mean going to hell. I mean that if we do not fix the problem, we are destined for a reset. Because Torah is not happy with the injustices, not happy with the killings, not happy with the judgments, not happy with us diminishing it itself, which consequently, I would say, is the true spirit of the Antichrist. The true spirit of the Antichrist is an absolute change of times and seasons and laws. And that in the Hebrew, in Daniel, is Moedim, feast days. These are the Moedim of Yahweh, Leviticus chapter 23. Times, as in days, as in the change of the Sabbath to Sunday, right? Oh, let's take it a step further. Laws. What is that in the Hebrew? Torah. The change of Torah by a people. You can now see the dangers of what is actually happened. So what's the solution? The solution is that you need to find a ministry, a teacher, and begin to make lifestyle choices that reflect the actual ancient Hebrew nomadic value of the pictographs that are the language that Yahweh used to write his Tanakh. Of all the languages he could have used, he chose Hebrew and the nuances of Hebrew. And because of that fact, it is absolutely imperative that you understand that you don't speak it, you don't live it, and you don't know it. And those right there are dangerous enough to cause an injustice and damage to a people, to a place, to a land, to create a judgment from a prophet who observes that and decides what the outcome should be. So now you understand there is an important context that you are absolutely mandatorily commanded to judge if you observe certain things. But you are dangerously encroaching upon damage to your life, your family, your property, your friends, your values, the things you value, if you don't do that correctly. And I'm going to tell you, before you think this is black and white, and before you think I'm trying to scare you, you need to understand we deal with a very benevolent, compassionate, gentle, merciful, upending God. He can upend a judgment at any time. And guess what? He's more sovereign than Adam himself, who he gave dominion over the earth. Meaning that if there's a time where there's a necessity of intervention within the confines of mercy, he's going to activate it. And as a result of that, we can identify then that activation of mercy is some sort of override. So don't think for a second that I'm telling you, oh, well, if you judge a person, you're going to lose your special one. It's not what I mean. What I mean is that you need to be careful, because we don't know the level at which there will be an allowance of that to occur in order to create a balance that you don't even know needs to occur. So you may say, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't judge anybody then. No, that's not what I said. I said if you determine that an outcome needs to occur as the result of a determination of behavior, it better have a foundation of Torah, and you better be prepared to fall under that same judgment. That's it. That's all. Okay? But if you observe a violation that results in an injustice and do nothing about it, you'll fall under that same curse anyways. Meaning there is an absolute commandment to act. Okay? All right. Well, I think that pretty much covers it. You can tell now that the signal versus the noise is by what measure you are measuring a judgment. That's noise. Signal is what is actually necessary and why we were given that power and authority to do that in the first place. When it comes down to it, I can tell you, if you read Torah in its entirety, you will find that the context is social justice. And if you can't activate social justice within yourself under a determination that is correct and right and just, then there is going to be a consequence for that. And there needs to be an honoring of that. Okay? All right. Shabbat shalom.